Ten Commandments 2, Electric Boogaloo. Shalom, I'm the Messianic Torah dude, and this week's Torah portion is V'et Hanan. V'et Hanan comes to us from Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23 through chapter 7, verse 11. And one of the big parts of this week's Torah portion is the second reading of the Ten Commandments. And of course, this is being read to a different generation that it was read to the first time. The first time it was read to the people who had been immediately delivered from Egypt. And these are the people who had seen all the miraculous things that the Lord had done when he delivered them from Egypt, and the parting of the Red Sea and everything like that. And this was about 40 days after that whole Exodus had happened. So all of that was fresh in their mind. Now we're 40 years later. And this is the generation after. Remember, the previous generation was told that they would not enter the land of Israel. They would not enter the promised land because they hadn't believed what the Lord told them. So this new generation was hearing all of the commandments before they took possession of the land. It's sort of a reminder of what they need to do now that they are taking possession of what's been promised to them. But it's also a reminder of the mistakes that the previous generation had made. So what I wanted to do for this week's Torah portion is go through these Ten Commandments and kind of give a brief explanation and maybe a little bit more detail on what some of them said, because they are kind of confusing. So the first commandment starts in Exodus chapter 5, verses 6 through 7. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. What's interesting about this first commandment is it's really a building block, or it's a foundation for all of the following commandments. All of the commandments after this are built on this idea. And this first commandment establishes a couple of things. First off, it establishes that the Lord is the only God that we should worship, the only thing we should bow before. But it also establishes how our relationship with the Lord is like a marriage. Our relationship with the Lord, just like any other relationship, is built first and foremost on fidelity. The second commandment, in verses 8 through 10, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So here we have this commandment not to make any graven images, not to make any castings of things on earth, things in heaven, make statues of the planet in order to bow down and worship them. And what this essentially is saying is idolatry is when we worship the created rather than the creator. We worship the sun and the moon and the stars and the fish and the birds and the panda bears but we don't worship the God who made them. That's a ridiculous thing, but it's a trap that people fall into.
Bro, can I sit down?
This is Cherry's blanket. Cherry made this. This is like the most precious thing in the world to me.
Okay.
You can sit on the floor.
No.
The third commandment is in verse 11. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. This idea of taking the Lord's name in vain can be sort of expanded to understand not to treat the sacred like something common. You see, the Lord's name is something that we should hold sacred, and we should hold honor, and we should hold respect for. When you talk to ultra-Orthodox people, a lot of times what they will do is they will write the Lord's name G-D. They will leave the vowels out. Even with the word Lord, they will say L-R-D. And it's a way of showing respect. It's a way of saying, I'm not even going to come close to treating as common the name of the Lord. And this is out of reverence. It's that we should have such a high level of reverence for the Lord that even his name is something we don't want to run the risk of disrespecting. The fourth commandment comes to us from verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your ox or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Then the Lord brought you out from there with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, the Sabbath day is meant to be a day of rest. But not just any kind of rest. Rest in the Lord. Okay. And this is essentially saying that we're giving the Lord a day of the week. We're giving the Lord that whole day. We're saying, Lord, this is your day. With the fifth commandment, we move from commandments about how we should manage our relationship with the Lord to commandments about how we should manage our relationships with the people around us. In verse 16, we have, honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Honoring your father and mother is not limited to just showing honor to and respect to your parents. It's also showing respect to your elders, showing respect to that previous generation, and understanding that they have wisdom to impart. They have things to share, and they have things that they can teach you. It's also acting in a manner that will not bring disgrace on your parents. Thinking, I am a representative of my parents in everything that I do. Am I representing my parents well? Am I making my family and myself look bad by what I'm doing? The sixth commandment is in verse 17. You shall not murder. That's pretty much it. Sometimes it's translated as kill, but the appropriate word is murder. So, yeah, don't murder. The seventh commandment is in verse 18. You shall not commit adultery. And when it talks about adultery, this is sort of understood as a catch-all for all sexual immorality. But again, we go back to this idea of fidelity. In the same way we're commanded to be faithful to the Lord, we're commanded to be faithful to our spouse. I've also heard people explain that premarital sex is also forbidden by this commandment because even though you haven't married your spouse, you're still not being completely faithful to them. The eighth commandment, you shall not steal. Here's another one that's pretty self-explanatory, pretty short and to the point. The idea of taking something that belongs to someone else, either through violence or through conning them out of it, or trickery, or anything like that. Essentially, we should respect what other people own. The ninth commandment comes to us from verse 20. And you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, bearing false witness here is specifically talking about when you're called to testify about what somebody was doing or bear witness to an event. You shouldn't lie about something. But this also includes things like lies of omission, not telling everything you know, not telling everything that's relevant or information that somebody needs. And the 10th commandment comes to us in verse 21. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house. his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Covetousness and jealousy are two things that are often kind of confused in our modern language, but they are very different. Jealousy is when I want to hold on to something that belongs to me. If I see somebody flirting with my wife, I might get jealous because somebody's trying to take something that belongs to me. Covetousness is when you want something that someone else has, and more than that, you want them not to have it. Meaning, I see that my neighbor has a really nice car, and I want that car, and it's combined with a spitefulness that makes me want him not to have it. So that's a quick rundown of the Ten Commandments. Let me know what you think in the comments. If we gave you a laugh, give us a like. And if you learned something, give us a share. I'm the Messianic Torah dude. Shalom, and stay in the Word.